What you are about to see is not a standard police report. It is the documentation of a siege. Over the course of 4 freezing months, from October 2025 to January 2026, the Department of Homeland Security and ICE did not merely enforce the law. They executed a military campaign against a domestic population. This is a strategic autopsy of Operation Metro Surge. Spreading from the Twin Cities to St. Cloud and Rochester, federal planners applied the Blot theory, a strategy designed for foreign occupation, to the American Midwest. This presentation analyzes the operational directives and field reports that turned the North Star State into a testing ground for a new era of enforcement. The question we face is simple. What happens when a government treats its own suburbs like a battlefield? To understand the gravity of what unfolded in Minnesota, we must first understand the weapon that was wielded. This was not standard police work. This was the Blot theory, or tache d'huile, a counterinsurgency doctrine born in the colonial wars of Morocco under General Hubert Lyautey and modernized by General David Petraeus for the battlefields of Iraq and Afghanistan. Designed for foreign war zones, the traditional doctrine relies on a strict triad: clear, hold, and build. In a foreign theater, the build phase is the decisive moral counterweight. The occupying force must win the hearts and minds of the local population to ensure stability. But when Operation Metro Surge brought this doctrine to American soil, a dangerous inversion occurred. The Department of Homeland Security applied the paramilitary violence of the clear and the suffocating surveillance of the hold against U.S. residents. However, they deliberately severed the doctrine's final limb. There was no build. Instead of fostering stability, they inverted the goal to dismantle local governance and impose punitive measures. In doing so, they treated the suburbs of Minneapolis not as a community to be protected, but as an insurgency to be broken. To see the architecture of this siege, we must look through the forensic lens of the oil spot strategy. This is not a metaphor. It is a rigid military prescription with a lineage tracing back to General Hubert Lyautey in colonial Morocco and codified for the modern era by General David Petraeus in Field Manual 3-24. The doctrine demands 3 phases. Phase 1 is clear, purely offensive tactics designed to physically remove insurgents through kinetic, violent elimination of threats. Phase 2 is hold, the establishment of a permanent security perimeter, enforcing population control through biometrics and a high-density troop presence. In a war zone, Phase 3, build, is the decisive moment. It requires the occupying force to win the populace through improved governance and economic aid. But in Minnesota, federal planners stripped the doctrine of its humanity. They kept the violence of the clear and the shackles of the hold, but they never intended to build. They intended to break. Long before the first boot hit the ground, the federal government was already at war in the shadows. This was Phase 0, shaping the battle space. Operating under the Project 2025 framework, federal planners effectively reclassified sanctuary jurisdictions not as American cities, but as insurgent zones. This rhetorical shift was critical. It established the narrative necessity for a military-style intervention. The primary weapon in this phase was information. The Department of Justice executed a sweeping intelligence dragnet, subpoenaing state data, including driver's licenses and social service records. The surveillance was total. Stingray devices were deployed to digitally map immigrant rights groups, and the employment records of over 7,000 staff members at Hennepin Healthcare were seized. Publicly, The operation was sold as a surgical strike against the worst of the worst, heinous criminals posing an immediate danger. But the internal autopsy reveals a starkly different reality. Analysis shows that only 4% of the eventual detainees actually fit the criteria used to provide legal cover for the siege. The target list was a fabrication. The dragnet was the goal. In December 2025, the theory became kinetic reality. The federal government didn't just send officers. They deployed an occupying force. Between 2,000 and 3,000 federal agents flooded the Twin Cities, dwarfing the local Minneapolis police force 5-1. Among them were elite BORTAC paramilitary units, teams trained for war, now operating in American suburbs. The objective was shock and awe. They struck widely recognized pillars of the community to maximize psychological impact. Workplace raids hit local businesses like Brotex in St. Paul and True North Solar in Arden Hills. But the true escalation was the breach of traditional sanctuaries. Agents entered Roosevelt High School, detaining staff on the premises. They violated the sanctity of St. Gabriel the Archangel Catholic Church to deport an employee. And in the most harrowing display of this new clear phase, agents entered Hennepin County Medical Center, where a patient wasn't just guarded. They were shackled to their hospital bed for 28 hours. The message was unambiguous. There is no safe harbor. By January 2026, the operation metastasized into Phase 2, the siege. In military doctrine, the hold phase is designed to secure a perimeter. Here, the strategy was to create a non-permissive environment through mobile interdiction. The goal was no longer just enforcement, it was suffocation. Federal agents moved out of the shadows and into the commercial arteries of the city. Plainclothes teams patrolled the MSP airport and major shopping hubs, conducting suspicionless stops that turned routine errands into constitutional crises. The hold did not distinguish between suspect and citizen. We saw U.S. citizens detained while buying groceries at the Target in Richfield and the Hy-Vee in Robbinsdale, collateral damage in a war of attrition. Racial profiling became the operational standard. An American Uber driver was detained simply for accent verification. Even status offered no protection. The son of Representative Ilhan Omar was stopped by federal agents. The psychological toll was absolute. As Minneapolis Council member Jamal Osman described the new reality, people are not leaving home without their passport. The Twin Cities were no longer just under surveillance. They were under occupation. The operation was not static. It was a tightening noose. The tactical map reveals the grand strategy, a reverse ink blot. In traditional counterinsurgency, the oil spot is meant to spread safety outward from a secure center. Here, federal planners inverted the geometry. They worked from the outside in, seeking to stain the map with federal authority and obliterate the sanctuary spaces beneath it. The state was carved into rigorous zones of engagement. Zone Amber was designated for containment and encirclement, effectively cutting off the Twin Cities from their regional lifelines. The objective was explicit: sever the connections between the metro area and greater Minnesota, isolating the population. But inside the perimeter, in Zone Red, the directive was saturation and lethal force. From the industrial corridors of Brooklyn Park to the southern anchor of Rochester, the federal footprint expanded. This was not law enforcement. It was a siege designed to turn the state's geography into a grid of escalating force. On January 7, 2026, The strategy collided with reality in Powderhorn Park. This was the tipping point. The victim was not a foreign combatant, nor a criminal target. She was Renee Nicole Good, a 37-year-old U.S. citizen. The killing of Ms. Good by ICE agent Jonathan Ross exposed the chaotic friction of the clear phase. The official DHS account claimed the agent was rammed by a weaponized vehicle, justifying lethal force for officer safety. But witness testimony painted a darker picture. An agent stepping directly into the path of a moving vehicle and then firing through the side window as the driver attempted to flee. Military theorists call this the strategic corporal moment, where a single tactical action by a low-level operator has devastating strategic consequences. The killing of Renee Good shattered the community's paralysis. Fear instantly transformed into active resistance. Schools across the metro were forced to close, and for the first time, the National Guard was placed on standby. The killing became a catalytic event that irreversibly escalated the conflict. In the wake of Renee Good's death, the operational restraints evaporated. What followed was a tactical escalation rarely seen on American soil: the deployment of chemical agents in densely populated civilian zones. The conflict spilled into everyday spaces. At Rectangle Pizza on Lyndale Avenue, tear gas was deployed inside a functioning restaurant during civil unrest. In St. Cloud, shoppers at the Star City Mall were caught in clouds of chemical irritants used against protesters inside the shopping center. But the most shocking application of force targeted the most vulnerable. On January 14th, in what is now known as the Family SUV incident, federal agents deployed flashbang grenades and tear gas against a vehicle containing a family. 6 children were hospitalized as a result. The siege even reached the schools. Chemical irritants were used near Mankato East High School, and in St. Paul, school vans were physically interdicted by ICE agents. As the chaos mounted, the legal and political stakes reached their zenith. President Trump threatened to invoke the Insurrection Act to quell the very instability the operation had created. If the clear was violent and the hold was suffocating, Phase 3 was systemic. This is the inverted build. In the manuals written for Iraq and Afghanistan, the build phase is the moral corrective. The occupier secures the peace by improving governance, distributing economic aid, and treating local leaders as partners. Operation Metro Surge deliberately inverted this logic. The objective was not to improve governance, but to degrade it until the sanctuary status collapsed under its own weight. Federal planners waged a campaign of calculated economic ruin, targeting the labor force to decimate the meatpacking and construction industries that form the backbone of the regional economy. But the most distinct deviation was political warfare. Instead of partnering with state leadership, the Department of Justice weaponized the legal system against them. Governor Walz and Mayor Frey were not treated as elected officials, but framed in operational documents as insurgent collaborators. DOJ subpoenas rained down on state leadership, marking the final transition from a law enforcement operation to a direct assault on the state's political infrastructure. The siege did not just break laws, it broke the social compact. Nowhere was this fracture more visible than in the figure of David Easterwood. To the federal bureaucracy, he was the acting field office director for ICE St. Paul, the architect of the crackdown. But to his neighbors, he was the pastor of City's church. On January 18th, these two worlds collided violently. Activists disrupted his Sunday service, chanting "ICE out" from the pews. In a functioning democracy, This would be a civil protest. But under the logic of the siege, the state intervened with overwhelming bias. The Department of Justice launched investigations not into the federal policies causing the unrest, but into the protesters themselves, deploying federal resources to shield the enforcement apparatus. This dynamic illustrates what counterinsurgency experts call the accidental guerrilla syndrome. By embedding the conflict into the most intimate aspects of daily life, faith, and community, the operation radicalized a moderate population, forcing them to fight a war that had followed them into their own sanctuaries. On January 12, 2026, the resistance moved from the streets to the courtroom. In a desperate bid to assert sovereignty, Attorney General Keith Ellison filed State of Minnesota versus DHS. This was no longer just a policy dispute. It was open legal warfare. The state's argument hinged on the 10th Amendment. Minnesota argued that the federal government was illegally commandeering state resources to enforce federal will, effectively framing the operation not as law enforcement, but as a federal invasion. They further charged that the operation violated the Administrative Procedure Act, labeling the federal actions as arbitrary and capricious. The federal rebuttal was swift and absolute, relying on the Supremacy Clause and the executive's plenary power over immigration. The Department of Homeland Security argued that their authority was total and superseded state objections. The judicial outcome on January 16th offered a hollow victory. While the court issued a preliminary injunction blocking the use of force against peaceful protesters, it simultaneously affirmed the federal government's authority to continue the operation. The legal shield protected the voices of dissent, but it left the machinery of the siege intact. Now, we tally the cost. When we place the traditional objective of counterinsurgency against the Minnesota reality, a disturbing scorecard emerges. In the clear phase, the alignment was high, but strictly punitive. The traditional goal is to remove combatants. In practice, this meant the removal of so-called criminal aliens, but it swept up collateral citizens with equal efficiency. In the hold phase, the alignment remained high. The objective is to secure a perimeter. The reality was a regime of total surveillance, suspicionless stops, and aggressive data mining that turned the metro area into a digital panopticon. But it is in the build phase that the strategy reveals its true face: total inversion. Where doctrine demands an occupying force win hearts and minds to stabilize a region, Operation Metro Surge sought to dismantle local governance and engineer economic disruption. The conclusion is inescapable. The oil spot that stained Minnesota was not one of safety, but of aggressive federal supremacy. This brings us to the strategic aftermath: the Minnesota model. What happened here establishes a new paradigm for American governance. By normalizing domestic counterinsurgency tactics, from BORTAC paramilitary units to chemical warfare in shopping malls, Operation Metro Surge has actively degraded the norms of posse comitatus, the historic barrier between military force and civilian life. It reveals a fracture in federalism itself. The lesson for every governor in America is stark. State sovereignty in police powers is functionally hollowed out if legal resistance, lawfare, fails. The federal government proved it can simply overwhelm local jurisdiction. But the greatest danger lies in the reaction. Analysts warn of the accidental guerrilla effect. By treating a domestic population like a hostile insurgency, heavy-handed federal tactics risk radicalizing a moderate population, turning citizens against federal authority simply to defend their homes. The ink blot has landed. It seeks to stain the map with federal authority, effectively obliterating the sanctuary spaces beneath it. Finally, we examine the timeline. It reads less like a law enforcement log and more like a battle rhythm. It reveals the terrifying velocity with which civil norms can be dismantled. It began quietly on November 18th with a prelude raid at Brotex. But once Operation Metro Surge officially launched on December 1st, the escalation was exponential. By New Year's Eve, a patient was shackled to a hospital bed. By January 6th, 2,000 federal agents had saturated the metro. And just 24 hours later, Renee Nicole Good was dead. From that moment, the slide into chaos was irreversible. Within 2 weeks, we saw tear gas in restaurants, school vans interdicted, and the governor of a sovereign state subpoenaed by the Department of Justice. In just 60 days, a functioning democracy was brought to the brink of martial law. This timeline forces us to confront the ultimate question. Was this operation an anomaly, or was it a prototype? Is Minnesota simply the first ink blot on a much larger map? As we look toward the sanctuary strongholds of Illinois, New York, and California, we have to ask, is the North Star State just the beginning? The operational directives suggest that the siege of Minnesota was not the end of the war. It was merely the proof of concept.